The student population that I've decided to focus on for this presentation is youth with disabilities in the juvenile justice system. One of the largest areas for concern in the juvenile justice system is the overrepresentation of youths with disabilities. Youths who qualify for special education typically make up 31 to 41% of juvenile justice population in each state and 70% in the highest prevalence areas compared to 10 to 12% in US public schools. Roughly half of youths qualifying for special education in juvenile justice systems were labeled with emotional disturbance, followed by specific learning disabilities at around 38%. Mental health disorders are common among detained youth, especially depression, anxiety, conduct disorder, and PTSD. Youth with disabilities in juvenile justice systems are at higher risk of dropping out and recidivating. This leads to adults who leave the juvenile justice system becoming 3 times more likely to be incarcerated as adults, and it also makes becoming financially stable more difficult. One article referred to this as the juvenile justice pipeline, and it had to do with the way schools and the education in the juvenile justice system criminalize youths and set them up for a lifetime of incarceration. And a little side note, this graphic is a little dated, so it uses improper language and the numbers are a little bit off, but it was the closest representation I could find of the data. So critical considerations and barriers to employment outcomes. An emphasis on control and punitive practices that unequally affect students based on their race, gender, and disability have continuously pathologized individuals with disabilities in the juvenile justice system as criminals. And that was from the Incarcerated Women of Color article. And these actions contribute to criminalization and the creation of negative self-efficacy that leads to recidivism and decreases chances for financial success and positive employment outcomes. A practice that would support these students would be to reduce punitive processes and policies in schools, especially related to strict dress code for women. And if discipline needs to take place, it needs to happen non-discriminately and equally across all students. Schools also need to increase responsiveness to cultures in their practices in order to teach students fairly. Low access to community services and resources for incarcerated individuals prevents them from getting ahead towards reaching any type of employment goal. Because of security restraints, it is difficult to access transition-related activities like career fairs and work experience programs. One strategy that can be used to increase information and access to services would be community resource mapping for the student. Using this strategy will leave the student with a list of local services they can use, which will help them address deficits and create vocational experience when they were adjudicated. Students involved in the juvenile justice system have higher rates of school mobility, especially individuals with disabilities, because they can be involved in multiple systems of care. This creates inconsistencies in educational and vocational development, affects engagement and motivation, and limits opportunities to make meaningful connections to peers and adults. And this was from the Miller article on reducing recidivism. And there's a quote that said, "Those with disabilities who are engaged in education or employment at 6 months post-release, however, were almost 4 times more likely to remain engaged at 1 year." This quote highlights the need for immediate post-release employment, which is something vocational training programming can help while targeting the specific needs of the student presented by high rates of school mobility. Vocational programs like the Nashua Youth Reentry Project focus on high school completion, career preparation, and social support through career mentoring and service selection based on student needs. This can fight the inconsistencies and disengagement that are created by high rates of school mobility for individuals with disabilities in the juvenile justice system. Critical considerations and barriers to post-secondary education outcomes. The first one is lack of quality trained teachers. Oftentimes in juvenile incarceration centers, teachers do not have the experience or qualifications to be effective, and disciplinary staff roles can blend into the classroom. The Nancy B. Jefferson Alternative School inside of Cook County Juvenile Detention Center Bill to provide students with instruction or certified special education teacher. And this was from the article on special education halt and CPS. This results in disordinances in academic progress and record keeping that transfer, which are things that transition specialists can accommodate for incarcerated students with disabilities. They do this by organizing and guiding families through options and resources and making connections to special education or vocational programs upon release, which is proven to increase the likelihood of positive post-secondary education outcomes. And that was from Reducing Recidivism, page 418. Lack of parent involvement due to cultural differences and attitudes about disability has shown to be connected to increased delinquent behavior and incarceration and recidivism rates. That was from Crosby, page 10. The journal entry about factors impacting well-being. Mental, emotional, and financial stressors impact participation as well as dealing with issues of the juvenile justice system. One strategy that can mitigate some of the factors affecting how family involvement would be parent training, which could be useful because of the challenging relationships that these families have. The training should be focused on reducing stress and anger, as well as enhancing discipline skills and promoting positive interactions. Mental health disorders are also common amongst adjudicated and detained youth, especially depression, anxiety, conduct disorder, and PTSD. This is a barrier that causes students to have lower grades, fall behind in grade levels, score lower on tests, and increase risk for emotional disturbances. A service that could benefit this would be mental health services like free counseling. They are very important when considering the prevalence of mental health disorders in use in the juvenile justice system. Mental health and maturity of returning young offenders may dramatically affect their transitions back into school or their success in applying for employment. And that was from the Miller article again on reducing recidivism. And in conclusion, here's a quote from the Miller article that says, transition that says, or it sums up how lack of quality education and the stresses of incarceration negatively affect post-secondary educational outcomes very nicely. It says, at a fundamental level, juvenile justice incarceration is an interruption to youth education, often resulting in disordinances and academic services in progress, record keeping and transfer, and social integration. These facets contribute to mounting friction that slow individuals' academic momentum and likelihood of obtaining diploma. The juvenile justice system creates a lot of barriers to education, especially for students with disabilities, and the key to combating that is using effective transition practices like transition specialist planning, increasing knowledge and use of mental health services, and increasing parent involvement. And for my two multimedia resources to support individuals in the juvenile justice system and educators of them. The first one I found was a website called the Center for Parent Information and Resources, and the page was titled Resources on Reaching and Serving Students with Disabilities in Juvenile Justice. The website contained information, webinars, information centers for juvenile justice, advice for victims of the system, and parent resources. One of the resources provided, which struck me as very interesting, was the Open Court Video Series Resource Guide, which was a video guide series made by Henry, a young man with autism navigating the court system. I think that this resource can be very useful because all the materials and instruction are extremely universal and were already proven to be accessible to individuals with disability. It also relates to the potential needs of individuals with disability in the juvenile justice system. The second multimedia resource I found was another website called Ideas That Work, and the page was titled Improving Outcomes for Youth with Disabilities in Juvenile Corrections. The website was a well-organized guide of best practices for teachers. Best practices teachers can use to improve outcomes for these students. which is why it will be useful for my peers. For example, there was information and strategies on increasing family involvement, transition practices, and even teaching and assessment toolkits for parents of individuals with disabilities in the juvenile justice system. And there are my slides.